Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's CEDA live stream on supporting our recovery through stronger border management. I'm Melinda Salento, CEDA's Chief Executive Officer, and it's my great pleasure to be facilitating today's live stream event. As always, CEDA has been very determined over the recent months to bring to our members and our audiences the issues and the conversations and the discussions about the matters most important to Australia's economic and social development and to our future as a country. Throughout the COVID crisis, we've been focused not just on how we can respond to the crisis itself, but increasingly looking forward to how we can recover and build back a stronger economy, but also a strong community. We've done a fair bit of work, whether it's through live streams, podcasts and blogs and research reports. If you haven't already done so, I would encourage you to have a look at our website and have a look at the content that we've put out, covering a really broad range of issues. Before we get started with today's fantastic discussion and presentation, I did want to start by acknowledging traditional owners. Wherever you're viewing this live stream, where you and I are meeting on Aboriginal land. For me, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As we look to recovery here in Australia, I think one of the conversations that we are going to have to really reimagine, if you like, is that around the place and history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our community and in this nation, and to really open up a conversation around truth and reconciliation as the foundation for improved social, economic, health and education outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their communities. Now to today's discussion. We are fortunate to be joined by Michael Outram, APM, who is the Commissioner of the Australian Border Force. Michael is going to speak to us on COVID-19 and how that has impacted Australia's border operations and supply chain integrity. We'll have plenty of time after Michael's starting presentation to take questions, so you too can engage with that. If you haven't already done so, go online and download the Pigeonhole app, ceda.pigeonhole.at. The password is border, and you can ask questions through that app, and I can present those to Michael and we can have a good conversation around those. We also like to encourage you to engage with social media. If you're tweeting, tag us at CEDA_news, and today's hashtag is COVID-19. And with that, it's over to you, Michael, and welcome.
Thank you, Melinda, and it's a great privilege to be here with you all today, and thank you to CEDA as well for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of our insights about the Australian Border Force and how we're shifting our posture basically to better support economic recovery as we come through and beyond COVID-19, and how we might do that through strong border management. You might recall the ABF, we've been at the forefront of Australia's response to COVID-19, and we played a key role really, particularly in those early months, in slowing the arrival and transmission of the virus into Australia through the border controls and measures we put in place. But at the same time, we've been working really hard to keep the supply routes open, the trade supply routes in particular. COVID-19 has demanded incredible agency agility, way beyond anything we've experienced before that's been demanded of us. And it's been required us to rapidly develop new ways of operating. As soon as the first case of COVID-19 was confirmed in Australia, which is the 25th of January, we mobilised really swiftly and decisively, time and time again over those following weeks, to implement enhanced border control measures, often within hours of government decisions. And ultimately that, of course, has led to where we are today, where international borders are all but closed, except for returning Australians, permanent residents and a few exempt travellers. On that regard, we've had to establish new services such as travel exemptions, and we're continuing to support whole of government efforts to target biosecurity threats at the border. And we've also been preventing the export of essential goods that are needed here in Australia, such as face masks and gloves and hand sanitizer, and facilitating the import of critical goods for preventing the spread of COVID-19. An example would be that the ABF and the Mindaroon Foundation, we coordinated the rapid distribution around the country of 110 tonnes of medical supplies needed for the pandemic. And we've also helped to maintain vital supermarket supplies, both as a member of the government's supermarkets task force And through our efforts to prioritise these goods at the border, and our officers have been working literally around the clock to keep trade flowing smoothly, ensuring that Australians have basic essentials. We've also been continuing to play a central role in ensuring that critical air freight services are available to Australian traders, including those who ordinarily rely on regular passenger services to carry their freight. And the government, of course, has helped to fill the void to an extent, at least, by providing funding and support for dedicated air freight services that didn't exist before. And our ABF officers are continue to provide, of course, customs and vessels clearances to support that substantial effort. And I'll just give you some sense of the scale of those operations and the changes in the patterns of trade and movement of goods. Air cargo patterns have shifted substantially, and in 2019-20, we processed 57.8 million air cargo consignments, and that's up from 53 million the previous year. Wharf activity actually remains strong, with redirected e-commerce resulting in a 32% increase in the number of consignments arriving by sea in the past financial year. And from February the 1st to the 30th of June this year, we processed over 2.4 million incoming sea cargo consignments. That's an 89% increase in the same period last year. So these shifts, as you can imagine, and add to that some of the state border closures, what's happening in Victoria, these shifts are creating new pressure points that didn't exist before, and we're working with industry constantly on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the response measures. And my Customs Advisory Board, which is made up of CEO-level industry representatives, has been actually instrumental in helping me to steer through some of these challenges and providing advice to government based on those discussions with the board. And we're also connected with industry and government through a range of existing trade and travel forums and meetings, and we've had to continue to do that to resolve operational bottlenecks that will continue to emerge. And through these mechanisms, we've provided industry with complex policy advice at times on specific issues that have arisen from changes to border requirements, maritime crew, for example. This collaboration has been vital to ensuring a balance between protecting our community whilst allowing essential economic activity to continue. And as you'd imagine, we had no playbook for managing a lot of these challenges back in January. And I'm pretty proud of my officers in the way that they've leaned in really to help protect our borders and keep trade and goods moving. Effective border management in the future, looking forward now, it seems obvious to me that the way we manage the border will be critical to how we support economic recovery through and post COVID-19. And in October this year, we're pre-positioning ourselves already. We'll commence the rollout of a new operating model in the ABF. And this is really going to sharpen our focus on working and partner with industry and on agile operational delivery. And as a first step, I'm moving 4 of our assistant commissioners to be geographically relocated from Canberra into Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne by October this year. The globalised economy, increasingly complex supply chains and the growing volume of goods that I described that are crossing our border has, of course, in part been driven by e-commerce business models. And COVID-19 has actually disrupted that particular side of the trade equation. And less business-to-business trade, more business-to-consumer, and of course, consumer-to-consumer trade. And we're seeing different players emerging across the global e-commerce supply chain now with an increasing presence of commercial logistics companies, small courier firms, and online marketplaces. And Australia's prosperity, of course, relies on how quickly and easily our businesses can trade internationally, and the border, and how seamless the border is for them. And we remain committed to fostering and facilitating trade, whilst at the same time strengthening supply chain integrity and security, because building on existing programs like the Australian Trusted Trader program is really important in that regard. We have established a whole of government single window task force in the Australian Border Force, and Australian business wants a simplified and integrated trade approval system, for example, including a trade single window to cut red tape at the border, put simply, saving industry time and money and boosting, of course, our economic productivity as a nation. A trade single window will capture enhanced supply chain information, which will help us simultaneously for customs risk management, which could be made publicly available potentially and increase visibility of supply chains for everybody who operates within the supply chain. And this will support new approaches for coordinating the movement of our supply chains, the regulation of our supply chains, and managing cargo and logistics in a far more integrated and seamless way. At the moment, we tend to sort of bolt on our regulatory processes to the supply chain rather than integrate them into the supply chain. International experiences suggest benefits from a single window will include improved efficiency of logistics networks, increased trade and investment and greater resilience of supply chains. And establishing a single window for international trade, though, isn't just an IT project. Successful rollout will require that we align the rules and processes across government and adopt common data standards and systems. It's consistent with the government's deregulation agenda to reduce costs and relieve regulatory bottlenecks and generate economic activity. More broadly, the ABF is undertaking a transformative agenda to simplify our trade system to support Australia's economic recovery and contribute to restoring productivity growth. It's a whole of government initiative that involves adopting best practice regulation and compliance processes supported by cost-effective technologies, business systems, data analytics, and a modern workforce. Of course, government's coffers are not flush with cash at the moment, so whatever we put forward has to make sense economically. The transformation involves more than digitising existing regulatory activities. It's a long-term process of well-planned disruption and improvement to our existing compliance models and practices. And this will require a high degree of coordination and collaboration across all government agencies that have border measures. Exactly what a simplified and modernised future will look like will continue to evolve as technology opportunities emerge, for example, screening technologies. And as new approaches are tested against robust performance metrics which are adjusted over time. At a human level, though, seamless trade facilitation will require us to strengthen engagement and deepen trust and relationships with industry and key stakeholders in states and territories. I personally think, and my experience in this organisation now for 5 years, that we can, in the ABF, and in fact we have to co-design the supply chains that simultaneously facilitate trade, but also strengthen integrity. Strong compliance and enforcement actually supports the integrity of our trading system, and it actually levels the playing field and engenders confidence for Australian businesses and our trading partners and offers protections at the same time for our community. Interconnected, agile, complex global supply chains actually heighten border risks, such as cross-border smuggling and diversion of prohibited items, such as narcotics and firearms, revenue evasion and fraud. And we're really focused on strengthening supply chain integrity, and we're working with federal, state and territory law enforcement and intelligence partners to target and reduce the threat of serious and organised crime, who have proven their ability to infiltrate supply chains globally and here in Australia. The modernisation and diversification of supply chains provides an opportunity, though, for us in the ABF and our partners with the availability of richer supply chain information and data to enable us to facilitate simultaneously trade and make it harder for chiefs and criminals, frankly. And I think a robust cargo supply chain that optimises legitimate trade and is resistant to criminal influences and revenue loss actually supports the prosperity, security and safety of the Australian community. So before I take questions, I'll quickly touch on travel and tourism, and that's going to play a key role as well in economic recovery. And in 2018-19, we processed over 46 million air and sea travellers, and that was a 17% increase over the previous 4 financial years. And prior to COVID-19, we projected that trend continuing. In 1920, the number of air and sea travellers, of course, is reduced by 26.9% and 14.6% respectively. And of course, they were significantly impacted by a 97.5% reduction in air travellers and 51.3% reduction in sea travellers just in the fourth quarter. So prior to COVID-19, travellers contributed over $1 billion to Commonwealth revenue annually through the passenger movement charge, and international visitors injected $44.6 billion into the Australian economy. And in 18-19, revenue collected from visa applications alone was $2.3 billion. So you can see as we emerge from COVID-19, we have to, in the ABF, be positioned to support port operators, airlines, cruise operators and industry and government partners to restart travel. At the moment, we're in a 14-day mandatory quarantine lockdown. The international is effectively closed. It's hard to imagine that we'll wait until everyone in the world is vaccinated before we start to reopen the international border. So we have to redesign that, because whatever we do through engagement with and collaboration with industry, government partners here and abroad, it will have to be and support COVID-safe travel. And so we'll leverage new and emerging technologies in doing that, digitisation, and automation to identify a future operating model that is far more streamlined and secure. We're working with industry to innovate and explore advances in biometric technologies to streamline data collection, to support contact tracing, for example, remove duplication and reduce touch points, and expand on our smart gate technology. And we're also collaborating with leading international industry partners such as the International Air Transport Association and International Civil Aviation Organisation to ensure our future approach in Australia and principles of using facial biometrics align with global thinking and international best practice. So on a final point, as Australia's frontline border law enforcement agency, the ABF will continue to evolve and adapt to support Australians' pandemic response and post-COVID recovery. And the result will be a more effective and efficient system of border protection. And we intend to deliver a more prosperous and dynamic economy in the end and increase confidence in border protection. So I'll pull up there and happy to take questions, Melinda. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Michael. Wow, that was quite the traversing of everything that Australian Border Force does. And it's interesting because I have to say, in preparing for this, I did go and have a look at your website, and there's probably a few things in there that hadn't sort of dawned on me, at least in terms of the scale of the activity and the breadth of activity. And, you know, even things like reminding myself that I think there's 60 international seaports around the coastline of Australia, and you're just even thinking about that and how you get your head around kind of maintaining the integrity of those, particularly at a time when there's such heightened degree of interest in that. And then just the sheer volume of involvement around air travel and air passenger travel, as you spoke to, it's quite impressive, I have to say. I think, Michael, the first question I sort of wanted to talk to you about was something we were talking about before we came on air, which is really just trying to understand a little bit more the extent of the shift in activity that you and the organisation have had to go through. And I've perhaps been reminded of this in my conversations with people from Australian Post, where, you know, we hear about, you know, the level of activity being like Christmas on steroids, you know, all of the time at the moment. And you would have seen the same in terms of having to process all these consignments and parcels, while at the same time, the level of activity involved in processing international travellers has just dropped away completely. So how have you managed that, and how is the organisation coping with that?
Yeah, so initially, I would have to say the agility came from allowing the officers at the front line to make the decisions about how we're going to implement government decisions. We couldn't afford to set up committees back here in Canberra and work through, you know, with grandiose sort of plans. We have over the last 3 or 4 years been doing a lot of desktop exercising, preparing ourselves for various different crises and in improving what we call our command control and coordination arrangements within the organisation. That helped us a lot. Our frontline officers were tremendous through the first few weeks, and even the way we did things at airports, whilst the numbers have come down, we could process previously about 3,000 or 4,000 passengers an hour through Sydney. At the moment, it's about 120 an hour because of social distancing, health checks, getting them onto buses, getting them into quarantine. So the work of the officers at the front line has changed exponentially. We've had to map, though, the skill sets of all our officers around the country so we can understand where we can service them into. So a lot of, as you say, have had to go into cargo and mail operations to do things they weren't doing before. So we've had to provide online training, change the way we deliver training, and frankly take a bit of risk because what we've developed over the last few months is imperfect. It's not something we would have particularly wanted to put in place maybe 12 months ago. Also, we've had to stand up new services. So the exemptions regime, we started running that on Microsoft Outlook. And within weeks, we've got thousands and thousands of people applying to come to Australia from overseas and to leave Australia. And I've got officers trying to run this on Microsoft Outlook. So we've had to introduce a new IT system to support that and bring the Department of Home Affairs decision makers who normally do visa decisions and industrialise that. And we've had to stand up really quickly. We're now turning around all outbound applications within 48 hours. That wasn't the case 2 months ago. We were in a world of hurt. So working on the fly, there's the top team here managing fatigue levels, but really people just having to come and do sprints on issues and problems. And even now, of course, as government, national cabinet and our own government look for alternative solutions going forward to how we create a biosecure border, you can imagine how much work we're having to do behind the scenes to try and design with the Department of Health and states and territories and airlines and airports what that might look like. And then the implementation will again be difficult. So people thought closing the border was hard. I can tell you opening it will be exponentially harder. So I think in terms of the agility, though, what we're trying to do now, if I'll finish on this point, because I could talk all day about this, is we've discovered this incredible agility in our officers and our organisation. We want to bake that into our DNA. So we are going to implement a new operating model in the organisation going forwards, where officers don't just come to work in an airport. They'll now come to work. They could be working anywhere that day. In essence, that's what we're trying to achieve.
Well, I'm going to come back and delve into that a little bit more, but I'm going to pick up on one thing. It probably won't surprise you to know that this issue around exemptions, the shift into having to authorise people wanting to enter and leave the country under these extreme scenarios and situations we're in at the moment, is the first question that I've received. You probably expected that. But I do have a question from Daniel Estrin from Estrin Saul, Migration Specialist. So you can guess where this is going. Daniel's sort of flagging the fact that obviously there's inconsistencies. You've just spoken to, really having to kind of evolve this as you're going along. His specific question is really around those inconsistencies and whether the ABF is looking into different ways of processing, and he's referencing batch processing. So for corporate clients in logistics, as one example, to sort of develop a more consistent approach. So perhaps maybe just a response to that, but a bit more thinking about how you're managing this. And if I could tack on one question, Michael, I'm interested in how your organisation is handling the public focus on all of this.
Right. So in terms of how we're managing it, so it started off with the delegation came to me. So people who wanted to come to Australia, I was with my chief of staff. We were up till midnight going through individual cases. The policy from government is, though, case by case. So the general default position is there's a travel ban. And the general default therefore is nobody goes, but they've given me classifications of groups of exemptions, and the business community, generally speaking, for economic activity is covered. So we've given guidance. We've delegated that down now to quite a junior level because of the volume of decisions we have to make and the time frame to turn them around. And sure, decision makers may get things wrong, and we review those decisions constantly, because if we get something wrong, then we'll correct it. But it's very hard when you've got one category of people who can go for, say, because somebody's dying, a sister or brother or mother or child is dying, or a funeral, and somebody is going to go for economic purposes. As an operational person, I don't even try and reconcile those two things. They are two different decisions based on different criteria. Now, I think we're getting better at it, but we will always, given the thousands of decisions we're making, and most people, by the way, getting an approval, there will always be the ability for somebody to point to an individual case and say, oh, but look at this. And we're learning from those, but they're quite junior decision makers, some of these people, and they're turning around a lot of these decisions in quick time, but they are trained to make visa decisions. So it's not as though they're just new to this sort of administrative process. In terms of the public perception, look, we just have to talk about the volume of this thing. We're getting about, I think in August, there was about 18,000 Australians and permanent residents that got an exemption and left Australia in August, about 18,000. 26,000 applied in August. So, you get the idea of the numbers here. And for inbound exemption requests, for people who are not Australians, of course, they have to get a request to come here, an exemption to come here. There's 16,000 of those in August. So we're dealing with huge numbers, but by and large, we're getting it right. But with those sorts of numbers, we're not going to get 100% perfection. I accept that. And we'll just take it case by case and fix it. It's hard to convince everybody. We try not to get into the media game. We're not trying to spin this. It's a tough gig. And we've got broad shoulders. We'll wear the criticism and we'll get things wrong and we'll try and fix it.
It can't be easy. It's an added stress at a pretty stressful time. I'm going to kind of segue from this, if I could, into the challenge around border opening eventually. And I think I've got one question here around, what a COVID-safe travel plan, COVID-safe travel might look like. I think there's interest in the extent to which ABF is being consulted around when and how borders might be opened. But just to make this an even bigger question, I'm also really interested in how you're engaging with your international counterparts, given that, it seems like we've got one of the strictest sort of international and, complete international border closures. So how does that play out in the conversations where they're probably seeing us at one end of the spectrum, and how you find a path to the middle?
Yeah, look, it's the policy decisions are obviously matters for government, national cabinet making their decisions on the advice of the AHPPC, who are our, medical professionals and experts in Australia. We similarly take advice from medical experts on what would be appropriate. That said, we are, of course, looking at what's happening in Singapore, and we are working with New Zealand to try and open a biosecure travel corridor in that regard, because New Zealand is pretty low risk. In Singapore, they're putting in place things like they're requiring some travellers to do a COVID test pre-departure, so in the country of departure, 72 hours before boarding. They have to be able to prove that they've been in that country for 14 days prior to departure, because it may be a low-risk destination with no hotspots. And then I think there may be things like a test on arrival in a couple of days or a few days in quarantine rather than 14. So there are other ways you can start to manage this, and we are looking constantly with Department of Home Affairs in particular, and DFAT, as you can imagine, and Department of Health, at what is happening around the world. But until the AHPPC and the National Cabinet really start to, I suppose, open up to the idea that we're going to start going that way, that we can just watch what the rest of the world is doing. And we are, of course, putting in place contingency plans. We've done a lot of work with the airport operators. So for example, Sydney, with Jeff Colbert and his team, we've worked out that we need to split the airport into two, a red zone and a green zone, because you don't want travellers coming in who may have a high risk of COVID-19 and need to go into 14-day quarantine, commingling with a passenger who's coming through a biosecure corridor. So you can imagine the border won't just open all of a sudden. There'll probably have to be different means of what the border looks like for different people, different categories of risk. It's interesting to see for us what's going on in Europe and North America, because they seem to be trying to open their borders whilst they've got quite high levels, frankly, of COVID-19. And of course, we're talking to them. I have a phone hookup this Friday night with what we call my Border 5 colleagues. So I was on the phone to them on about the 26th of January for the first time. That's my colleague in the United States, in New Zealand, in the UK, Paul Lincoln, and Canada, John Osowski. And we've been talking at least monthly through this, comparing notes, how we're doing things, what's happening in your jurisdiction, how you're thinking about solving that problem. And of course, we're doing that more broadly in the region. I've had calls with my counterparts in Indonesia, in Japan, in Singapore, so in Malaysia. So a lot of ongoing conversations, so we get a good handle on what's going on around the world, what other countries are doing with it, so we can try and extrapolate that to the Australian context once we get the green light to start doing that in a particular state or whatever the National Cabinet determines.
A huge task before you, and one that all of us frequent travellers are certainly watching with a fair degree of interest, I have to say, Michael.
Indeed.
Yeah, we've got a question around the supply chains issues, which you touched on. And the question is around, what you think or what you've seen has been the three most significant impacts on supply chains as a result of COVID, and certainly how they've been managed through your organisation. But if you wouldn't mind picking up on the comments you made about the focus on the shift from things coming in to also things going out.
Yeah, so in the early days, the biggest pressure on the supply chain was maritime crew. So the bulk carriers up on the Pilbara, vessels coming in from China into Northern Australia, into our ports in Queensland and Victoria and New South Wales, and each different port authority, each different state were approaching this differently. And that was creating confusion. And then we saw the emergence of, obviously, the state border controls, the domestic border controls, and that made it even harder to get crew in and out to man these ships. But of course, the bulk carriers are so crucial for our economy, taking the ore off the Northwest Shelf. So we with the Department of Infrastructure and others, met every week with the representatives of industry and the industry groups to talk through those changes and how we could best facilitate that based on AHPPC advice. The second thing is, more recently, because of the closure, the lockdown in Victoria, DHL, FedEx, all those companies are now bringing everything through Sydney. There's just not enough floor space. Sydney was already at Christmas levels, and now we've got all the things that were going into Victoria coming through Sydney as well. And that's creating a massive problems for us in terms of our processes and regulatory requirements on us, but also for those logistics companies. And we're working with them now whether we can create more warehouse space and how we can do things very differently. So that's been a huge impact as well. And then finally, I think there's been some shifts in relation to how organised crime are responding to this. And it's only a couple of weeks ago that we always have responsibilities as civil maritime security, as the Coast Guard, as it were. And with the AFP New South Wales Police, we interdicted a fishing vessel with 1.8 tonnes of cocaine on it coming to Australia. So the crooks, whilst they've had to adapt, and it's made it harder for them with less travel and all of those things, they haven't given up, and there's our detections of narcotics has gone up this year, possibly because we've surged more people into our cargo screening operations. So there's three examples of how things really have changed significantly. But that spike in, I'll give you a fourth. Containers, the LCL loads, they're now just full of these individual consignments that were previously going in air cargo. So it's made life a lot tougher in terms of unpacking and disaggregating the sea containers. So it's just been disruptive all around.
Yeah, it's been, I've certainly been talking to businesses around how they've been managing things. The Port of Melbourne, is something that's been raised quite a bit with me, and people talking about how we can do the best we possibly can to get goods flowing across the country, particularly given the extent to which people are now, as you pointed out, buying online and shopping differently, which is, increasing the complexity of this tenfold, if not more. But if I could just follow up, I was intrigued by your comments before we started the live stream when you were talking about intercepting things like PPE either on the way out, and trying to make sure that the integrity in and out of the country was sort of being maintained.
Yeah, so in the earlier stages in particular, you might recall there's a shortage of masks and gloves and PPE generally. The national stockpile probably wasn't where we needed it to be. And consequently, the government moved very quickly to ask us to start looking at what was going out. So normally we examine goods coming, primarily we examine stuff coming in, looking for drugs, looking for firearms and illicit things like that. We don't tend to do quite so much on what's leaving Australia. So we had to completely change, again, parts of our operating model there to start looking for masks and gloves, and we've seized millions. The problem here was price gouging. We weren't so much worried about somebody sending something home to a family in another country, 10 masks or whatever. But there were companies here literally sending, thousands of these things for commercial gain. And so we started to seize those things. In fact, we've redistributed some of those to frontline police services now and things like that. So that's a good news story. But since we started doing that, it's had the desired effect. We're seeing less now. It's changed behaviour because people know that we're onto it.
Yeah, well, that's not a bad outcome at all, is it? I thought we might sort of transition to a slightly different topic, if that's all right. Through your opening comments and in response to some of the questions, one of the standout things that's really you've spoke to is this deeper engagement with business and industry. And I'm really interested to understand that, how you've seen that shift, how you've managed that, and as you're looking at further simplifications to processes and regulatory arrangements, how you imagine that relationship working in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple of practical examples to make people can see where I'm coming from. So when you arrive at an airport now, first of all you do is you meet an immigration primary line. Might be a smart gate, might be an ABF officer, and you have to show your passport and get cleared from an immigration point of view. And then you go and get your bag, and then you get to the back of the hall, probably join a big queue, and you have to then clear both a customs and a quarantine type check. Now, if you were to design an airport today from the ground up, would you design it like that? I'd probably say you wouldn't. You'd probably want to get off the airplane, go and get your bag, wrap all the retail around the baggage hall, and then just walk out through a smart gate. So we can't implement that, though, on our own. We have to do that with Department of Agriculture, who've got the quarantine function, and with the airlines and airports and operators. And they haven't got the real estate at the moment configured to do that. So we have to look at opportunities like the new airport in Sydney to try and work with them to co-design what that might look like in the future. Air cargo. At the moment, air cargo comes off the belly of an airplane and goes to DHL or TNT or FedEx or Menzies or wherever. And we then have officers working in those facilities, the large ones, X-raying and scanning that stuff. Why wouldn't we do that at the airport before it goes anywhere? Because there are probably 400 or so other freight forwarders who we don't have a presence at their warehouses and depots, and we have to drive out there. And technology is coming to a point now, I think, scanning technology, where we can scan much more quickly at scale and at speed. And rather than having human beings looking at screens, looking for anomalies, you'd have the algorithms driving that. So that may be some years away now, but we need to start thinking about that. Where's the technology at? And rather than then, like with, let's say, Australia Post, where we have officers working full time, Australia Post present to us the things that we might be interested in, comes down a different conveyor belt, and we go through our screening processes. Why wouldn't we just integrate what we do into their sortation process? So they get a win at speed, and we get a win in terms of greater coverage. That requires trust, and obviously it requires a different way of thinking about how we do our job and how we're going to take the regulatory function. But most people I deal with in the industry, they don't want drugs coming in through the supply chain. They don't want people not paying their dues. So, the Trusted Trader program is a means of saying we can incentivize trust. And if we have trust, we can actually give you a lighter touch. So we have to sort of think about that in a technological sense as to what's coming forward. And we don't have all the answers because we don't know the complexity of that supply chain. We're not the experts in that. And we need to work with the people that are, especially as they're designing new elements of the design of the supply chain.
So let me just follow up on that in terms of this sort of co-design approach, if you like. It makes sense. But sitting alongside that as well is, in all likelihood, a co-investment conversation as well. And, from a business perspective, speeding up supply chains is as critical as anything, really. Reducing costs, obviously, but you spoke to the changes that might be required at airports. Airports are financially just underwater at the moment. I mean, they're really struggling. For them to imagine that they're going to have the money to be investing in new space, new technology or new design seems unlikely in the next little while. I mean, how creatively are you thinking about where you might find some opportunities aside from just new built facilities, and how business and government might work together both in designing that but funding it as well?
Yeah, well, the funding question is always going to be a vexed question. I think we need to do the homework. You've got to build a business case. So I don't see, this is as you rightly say, this is going to go over 10 or more years to try and modernise our border. Some of the low-hanging fruit would be, though, for example, at the moment, we still have people filling in, writing inbound passenger cards. And during the start of COVID-19, I had officers collecting those and scanning them into a system where they were being digitised, and then via the Australian Federal Police provided to states and territories for contact tracing. That's just not good enough. And, we've got, manifest information, advanced passenger information. The data's already out there. We just need to find a way of collecting it and harnessing it. So there is some low-hanging fruit. Trusted Trader, it doesn't cost much for organisations to come onto the Trusted Trader program, but independent analysis has shown that they all get economic benefit from it because of the number of benefits in that sort of system. In terms of speed, let's take Australia Post. If we can demonstrate that we can speed up their business without costing them any money, then there will be a conversation then about who pays for what part of that. And we've got to do that work with them, but there's no point in us doing it on our own. That's where the trust comes in. We've got to be able to work together and understand where the actual costs and where the benefits lie. And in terms of economic productivity, let me tell you this, there's a lot of Australian manufacturers and companies who just don't trade internationally because they see the border as being too hard. And in terms of comparative countries, we're quite low in that regard, and we've been falling down the sort of, the league table consecutively over recent years. Because the border is not attractive enough, and we can without even touching any IT system, we can look at our regulatory processes and our regs and our laws and all those things and do things very differently than we currently do. So we don't have to start with a big bang, billions of dollars investments, because you're right, the government hasn't got that, and certainly the airport operators haven't got it. But if we're going to build a brand new airport anyway, why wouldn't we design that? And if Australia Post are going to redesign their sortation or renew their sortation capability anyway, why wouldn't we at that point do that? So I think you're absolutely right. We've got to be sensible, and we've got to understand the points at which investments are going to be made in the future, because we will come out of this and we will start to trade our way out of it. But it's going to have to be staged. I agree with you entirely. So we're not going forward with a sort of a big bang idea. We'll spend a fortune and we'll all be good.
In terms of the movement of people, I've got a question here around simplification and cutting red tape, and essentially I think the question goes to what's the capacity to improve that in terms of the movement of people in and out of Australia. I'm interested, firstly, how you just talked then about for manufacturers the border feeling a bit harder than it ought. How do we compare in terms of the movement of people?
We're pretty good, actually, in terms of the movement of people. And we've been introducing smart gates, as you'd be aware, for a number of years now, and they've helped a lot. I don't know. When I first came to this organisation, I went to Sydney Airport and we had manual processing for outbound, and the queue from was out into the arrivals hall. It was just awful. It was at peak period. If you went there just before COVID started in December, before Christmas, you wouldn't see those sorts of queues in that departures area in Sydney Airport, because the smart gates have really fixed that problem for us. But moving on beyond that, I think that the biometric piece is the important thing for us, and then we've got to get over privacy and other issues. But bottom line is, if when you check in overseas, our systems know that it's you, know that you've got an Australian passport or a visa to come to Australia, and we can confirm that you're the same person that walks off the air bridge in Sydney, why couldn't you just go and get your bag and walk out? As long as we've got the biometric on the move through the airport. And if there's a problem with you because we want to intervene for some reason, the smart gate would then close on you so we can intervene. So this is an outline, a sketch of our thinking. Of course, there's thousands of problems with that to be solved. But in every border organisation I know is working towards that kind of future. But we can't do that on our own. And we can satisfy our needs as long as we know that you're you, and we know whether we should be worried about you or not from a customs, a quarantine or immigration point of view. Then as far as we're concerned, we don't need to actually interact with you at all.
I wouldn't mind looking forward to that.
I think we're all in the same boat there. I don't get special treatment IQ too.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. Sitting beneath that conversation, but also you talked about single window for international trade. You've talked a lot about digitisation and the improvement, the capacity to better use data for a whole host of things. But then in that conversation, you also said a few things that just raised some questions for me, if I could put it that way, which is about co-design with other jurisdictions, getting the same approach to systems and processes and data and all the rest of it. In Australia, that's always code for things not getting done. So how confident, I mean, we've seen the acceleration of the digitisation. How confident are you that you can get to a cooperative place where we can really progress those things now?
I think we've got a really good opportunity. So Andrew Metcalf came into the Department of Agriculture only in January, and we're going forward jointly to government now with a number of suggestions around border measures. So that means that the sort of the quarantine side of plants and animals and even human biosecurity to an extent, and ourselves, we're asking the right questions together, and we're making certain proposals to government together. In Department of Infrastructure, so the current exemptions regime and managing the caps, when I talk about the caps, I don't mean the quarantine caps in the states and territories. We don't want more passengers arriving than we have the capacity to put into quarantine nationally. We've achieved that by ourselves in the Department of Infrastructure and using their Navigation Act to work with the airlines to achieve that outcome. So I think that the pandemic has forced us to work more closely together. And sure, there's been some events have occurred that have probably exposed some problems that need to be fixed in the future at the border. And, Ruby Princess and those other things would be examples of that. But by and large, when you look at what's happened around the border, around this pandemic, I think you've seen that collaboration and cooperation, and we've got to extend that. So I'm optimistic. I'm more optimistic, and because I know where we are with the Department of Agriculture and Department of Infrastructure, who are two key interlocutors in that regard.
So you mentioned Ruby Princess, which gives me a nice chance to ask one of the questions, which I'm not sure that you are as well placed to answer this as you maybe appear to be, but the question is around a return to domestic cruising. And that would provide a big boost to tourism. Is it something that you think is a long way away? How far away? And what's that contingent upon?
I would say that reading the body language of the National Cabinet is important here. And when you look at things around domestic border restrictions, mandatory quarantine, 14-day quarantine for international arrivals, would make that probably difficult to restart at this point in time. So that's the first thing I'd say is we're going to be guided here by the AHPPC primarily, because it's on their advice. What I can say is that I know Joel Katz very well, and he's the CEO of the Cruise Line Industry Association. He's on my Customs Advisory Board. And I know that they've been working around the world and with the AHPPC to put forward plans as to how that industry can restart. And of course, there are other smaller countries in our region that economically want that to happen too. But I think that there's going to be a cautious approach would be my guesstimate in relation to restarting the cruise industry around our waters.
Yeah, that would be my sense as well, I have to say. But I guess it's watch this space.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a question before earlier. Again, a question from a viewer. You mentioned that you're making some changes organisationally. You're shifting people out of Canberra. You mentioned assistant commissioners, I think, going to Brisbane, Melbourne,
Sydney and Perth.
And Perth. Okay, that was the question: is whether Perth was one of those locations.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay. So count Perth in. Another quick tidy up, if I can put it this way. In processing exemptions, I think the question is, if you get it wrong, is the process required that people just simply have to reapply, or is there some grounds for asking for reconsideration, or is it just a case of continuing to reapply at the moment?
Well, they can ask for reconsideration. Ordinarily, what's happening here is that we will ask more information. So if somebody's not given permission, it's either because they don't meet the criteria. Quite often, they actually don't need an authority. They've already got one. They don't realise it because of their status of their visa or their nationality or what have you. But ordinarily, the case is we're asking for further information, evidence of a particular, whether it's work overseas or whatever it might be. So that sometimes it will require a reapplication, and sometimes require that they just provide additional information. It would depend on the circumstance.
Right. If in doubt, reapply, I think is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, as I say, we are endeavouring to get all these decisions right, but we have changed our mind a few times. When something's been cast out and we look at it and say, okay, yeah, we probably should have done that differently. But I don't want to criticise these decision makers because they're working tirelessly to get through these. And every now and then, I'd look at something and say, yeah, I'd probably made a different decision. But that's the nature of administrative decision making. There is no sort of Monte Carlo analysis here that we can run and gives us the answer.
Yeah, I think it sounds fairly complex and complicated from how you've described it. Michael, I think you've answered this question, but we have got a question from the audience around the commodity exports again and what's being done to allow safe travel corridors to facilitate the change of seafarers from vessels at commodity ports. Is there anything else you sort of wanted to add to that?
Well, it's the situation at the international border is clear and the policy is clear with the Commonwealth Government. Of course, the difficulty here is the different state and territory arrangement that exist in terms of quarantine requirements, the border controls that are in place, the border closures that might be in place, and those sorts of things. So that's beyond our control. Each state, as you obviously hear it from the National Cabinet, has got its own sort of different approach to this. Western Australia, island within an island, New South Wales more open, and then Victoria in lockdown. So it's difficult for me to provide too much guidance on it. It really depends on which state the activity is in, and there needs to be engagement with that state government. In many of the states, it's the police that are running the function. In some, it's the health department. And again, that varies state by state. So, if it's about an international border problem, we can help with Department of Infrastructure, and we have been engaging with industry from day one in relation to the international border.
Okay, thanks. I think you've piqued the audience's interest talking about drug seizures and the like. And so the final question we've got through Pigeonhole is around what sort of increase you've seen in illicit drugs and contraband during the COVID crisis, and how has the ABF identified the perpetrators and patterns around that, given that the shifts that we've seen and we've talked about earlier?
So it's been interesting. The Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission run this wastewater analysis program nationally and have been doing for some time now, looking at the patterns of drug consumption around Australia, and they can extrapolate to volume. So we know, for example, I think it was last year around 8 or 9 tonnes of meth was consumed in Australia. Most of that would have come through the border. And a lot of it by sea cargo, but also small scattergun importations by air cargo and mail. That hasn't changed. In fact, we've seen a significant uptick in relation to detections. So 19% increase, as I say, in the first 6 months of this year on last year. And that's 9,800 detections. And we have had, as I say, the largest detection of cocaine at sea ever coming to Australia. And that was a few weeks ago, probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, out off the east coast of Newcastle. And that involved a Chinese fishing vessel, and it's a vessel in in Australia. So it's a constant challenge. The drugs cartels in South America, in China, and other places haven't given up. We're a very lucrative market. Unfortunately, it's not all kids, but our youth seem to be willing to pay a lot of money for narcotics. But I do understand that there may have been some changes to the kinds of drugs being taken because people are sitting at home, sort of less party drugs and more other sorts of drugs. And we're also seeing huge amounts of illicit tobacco being imported at the same time. So illicit smuggling of goods hasn't stopped. And a horrific thing is we pick up and still look for child sex light dolls and firearms parts and these sorts of things, asbestos. We're still looking out for all those sorts of goods as well being brought in. But I'd say that domestically, certainly we're seeing changes in patterns of domestic distribution of narcotics because of the border closures. So we're having to look out now for where something might have been moved from a particular state to a particular state by road. The likelihood is now it will come in by air, mail, or international mail rather, or air cargo, etc. So we are having to be on our guard for those sort of shifts in patterns.
Michael, in the last couple of minutes, I might take you on to a more personal question, if I could, which is just, one of the things that we've been asking many of the leaders that we've been speaking to on these live streams is, how they've adapted their leadership style to deal with some of these challenges, the incredible uncertainty, the agility that's now required, and just the chopping and changing all the way through. And we're feeling it right now through COVID, but of course for many leaders, particularly at the forefront of these issues, it's also was the bushfire crisis earlier on this year. So I'm just interested in for a couple of minutes, if you wouldn't mind just reflecting on, whether you've had to change your leadership style and how you've dealt with that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I never changed my style. I've sort of believed that, you're the leader you are is the person you are, and you can't change your personality, nor have I tried to. But certainly the way that we work as a team, I think has changed through all of this. And in the first few weeks, I had to change very quickly from, we're bureaucrats, we're public servants. We just couldn't afford to bureaucratise the implementation of government decisions. When the government asked us to close the border with China, I don't mind telling you, the Prime Minister looked at me and said, "Michael, how long do you need?" I had no idea. We'd never done it before. And I kind of said, "Well, can you give me till tomorrow morning?" And we'd done it by 9 o'clock that night. But what I couldn't do was set up a whole lot of committees and ask for a whole lot of paperwork and do a whole lot of assessment around a risk. We had to do it on the fly. So that'd be the biggest change for me, is we had to just accept a lot more risk, trust a lot more in our people at the coalface, that they know what they're doing, and accept that there will be variation, therefore, between Sydney and Melbourne and how things were implemented on the ground. And that's what we did. So that was a fairly significant sort of shift. And for the first 6 weeks, we had to have that I guess, that approach before we started to gear up our what I would call proper administrative back end around that. So we had good, better governance and better risk assurance and those sorts of things. And now the challenge is, I think, to not lurch too far to the right and over bureaucratise. If one thing I can take out of this is that we can be faster, more agile, more lean. And the other thing that we've been doing on that regard that I've done is I've tried to create some informal networks around the organisation outside of the formal hierarchy and bureaucracy. So we can have ongoing conversations about risk and about strategy with officers all over the organisation. And innovation, you can imagine, we've had to do things very differently. And out of this has come quite a lot of innovation. But again, I don't want officers writing minutes about innovation and their best idea. It starts with a conversation. And so we have changed. We've got obviously, as public servants, have to have hierarchy and bureaucracy and all of those things. It's really important. But at the same time, we've got to find a way, another way as well, at the same time, of creating strategy, of testing ideas, of identifying risk, because the bureaucratic process can't keep up.
Well, thank you, Michael. What a great way to finish our conversation. And it's really interesting for me to see the similarities that are coming out of these conversations.
I've lost the feed. I know there's the thing is we're experiencing.
So I'm terribly sorry about that interruption. As luck would have it, my computer chose exactly that moment to disconnect and restart. So my sincere apologies. What I was concluding by saying is it was fascinating to me the similarities in Michael's observations about the agility that's been required and how leaders have been adapting, the things that organisations have done when they've had to and what they've been able to achieve, particularly with allowing their employees to take a bit more risk and trusting them to do so. I think one of the things that I've heard a lot about is how we can make sure that we capture the lessons from that and make sure that we continue with those as we move into the recovery phase. So again, please accept my apologies for the slight glitch there. I am going to close by saying that we've still got the Pigeonhole app open. If you want to ask some more questions, please do so, and we'll endeavour to get some answers out to you via email. And of course, I would like to draw your attention to a couple of live streams that we've got coming up at CEDA. Tomorrow we've got a live stream on climate through recovery, and next week we've got a fantastic live stream on the future of Australia's higher education. A final plug for some of CEDA's content. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, our Chief Economist, Jared Ball, on the Economist Corner this week had a great conversation with Jane Hunt, who is the CEO of the Front Project, about a report that they've put out this week on how to optimise childcare subsidies to ensure that as we move into recovery, we have no barriers to the participation of women who, of course, have been really adversely affected by declining employment through this crisis. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, I would encourage you to do that and to have a look at the Front Project report. You can access those at ceda.com.au. Thanks again for joining us.